There is a side to this conflict that explains why Russia is doing what they're doing right now, as opposed to 3 years ago or waiting 3 more years. But that would be to misunderstand what is ultimately motivating Putin's worldview and his actions against Ukraine.
This person asks, I've been conscious of the propaganda from the media lately, especially after the pandemic. I'm wondering if much of the world is falling prey to propaganda around Russia and Ukraine. Is there a side to this conflict that explains why Russia is doing what they're doing without demonizing them? Also, I don't understand how the Russian church and the Ukrainian church play into this. Is there a faith element to this conflict?
Man, yeah, those are two big loaded questions, and neither one of us are, the historical experts on this. We've been talking a lot about this on our editorial team with our resident historian, who, because of his big, long, epic beard, looks like a Russian oligarch anyway. Let me just say this. One of the challenges that happens when wartime occurs is that you start using warlike language for everything. And the other thing that happens is you divide the world into good guys and bad guys. There's an interesting thing, story during the Second World War where Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and this resistance group trying to overthrow Hitler from the inside of Germany reaches out to Britain and specifically gets to Winston Churchill. And as the story goes, Churchill says, "Nope, don't have time for it." And his reason was a strategic one. One, he didn't think it would work, and two, he needed to continue to paint Germans as the bad guys, and by Germans, all Germans. And the idea that there were some Germans doing the right thing in Germany would undermine the British war cause. Now, whether that was a good decision or a bad decision, my point is, the tendency is to check the box of here are the good guys and here are the bad guys, and to see everything through that lens, particularly at a time of war. This goes back again to Solzhenitsyn, who said, if only there were the bad guys that we could round up and get rid of, and it would fix the world. Now, because there's not, just because the line of good and evil runs right down the middle of the human heart, just because you see the fall on both sides of the Russian-Ukrainian war, does not mean that they're equal violators of peace, does not mean they're equal aggressors, does not mean that it's not Putin who has for a long, long time made his intentions very clear of wanting to recapture at least the territory and the glory of the former Russian Empire. And this is how he thinks. And one of the reasons that it's difficult for us to think beyond this is because we don't think in terms of these long histories. Certainly Islamic nations do, and certainly some of these nationalistic commitments to the history of the nation. We don't even teach our own history, much less a revised version of our own history. Well, I guess we do teach a revised version of our own history, but it's not like a pro-history. It's a different mindset. So when this question asks, is there a side to this conflict that explains why Russia is doing what they're doing? There is a side to this conflict that explains why Russia is doing what they're doing right now, as opposed to 3 years ago or waiting 3 more years. But that would be to misunderstand what is ultimately motivating Putin's worldview and his actions against Ukraine. The other thing is there propaganda from the media lately. Of course there is. You can just bank on that. The most blatant and egregious forms of propaganda, however, are Putin's run-up to this conflict, to his invasion, saying that Ukraine is not really a state, or not really an independent state, or shouldn't be an independent state, making up claims about genocide in the Ukraine, calling the country, certain forces within the country Nazi, even though the president is Jewish. I mean, this is observably absurd pretext for war that has even taken by surprise people who have been in strong diplomatic relations with him in the past, like Condoleezza Rice and others. So understand kind of the temperature behind this is a skepticism of media, which is healthy and oftentimes necessary. Also a thought that that painting the entire one side as good and the entire other side as bad doesn't do justification to the human condition, because it doesn't. At the same time, it doesn't mean that one is not more guilty of this particular conflict than another. And I think pretty clearly this is, Putin's actions that are unjustifiable by any sort of framing of just war theory, not to mention just kind of, modern life together. The Russian church and the Ukrainian church do play into this, but there's a long history, and we're working on some commentaries to articulate some of these histories, and we're just wanting to get everything right. The Russian and Ukrainian church split, and of course this was part of the larger story of the Orthodox Church splitting off of the Roman Catholic Church even centuries before. But understand, in Putin's Russia, the Russian church is subject to the state, at least subject to the whims of the state. So there's a nationalism and a religious nationalism that Putin has been appealing to in his justification for the war that I don't think is justified in any sort of theological context or even historical context. There also is a sense in which, and this is the part we're working on, and I don't want to give too many details because I just want to make sure all the details are right, but that Ukraine offers a level of religious freedom that Russia does not. In other words, there is a sense of belonging. You're a Russian citizen, Russian nationalism, Russian orthodoxy. Ukraine has higher levels of freedom of conscience. And of course, the Ukrainian ambassadors are painting this completely as Russia is threatened by the freedom that Ukraine enjoys. Ukraine has been a successful nation state outside of the Soviet Union, and that's something that is a grave threat to Russia. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. There's certainly more to the equation than just the Ukrainian ambassadors are painting it, because again, it's wartime. They're painting the good guys versus the bad guys. That doesn't change the fact that they're the victims of this aggression and that Putin is the perpetrator of the aggression. And the Russian people don't have a lot to say about it. The Russian churches do not have the influence over the Russian state. The Ukrainian churches enjoy some level of freedom. There's a sincerity of faith among many in the Ukraine that goes way back. So all of that is kind of part of this story as well.
The setup to this question talks about being conscious of media propaganda, and the idea that there must be another side to this because the wrong people, ideological enemies, and then I'm reading between the lines here, are for Ukraine. And this instinct is very common, I think, especially among religious conservatives in our country. And it's been given a name by one of my favorite bloggers, Samuel James. I've had him on the podcast a number of times. He used to work for the Southern Baptist Church's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And he has this great Substack where he talks about, various things like this. And he just a couple of days ago published a piece about his opposition to what he calls negative epistemology, that we can know what's right by picking the opposite of what our ideological enemies think. So if the globalist media, if the mainstream journalists, if the corporations and the Democratic Party say one thing, then we should automatically side with the opposite, that we should say the other thing. And I think there is an undercurrent of this, and you see it even in some of the right-wing admiration for Vladimir Putin, which is very odd, historically and ideologically. It makes very little sense. It's the definition of strange bedfellows. But, the guy was formerly a member of the KGB. But it's happening precisely because many are looking at the consensus of major corporations and liberal politicians and so forth, saying, no, this invasion is unjust, and thinking we can't agree with them. They must be trying to push an agenda, pull the wool over our eyes in some way. Therefore, the opposite has to be true. I don't think that's very nuanced or careful or even responsible thinking. I'm not saying this listener is necessarily doing that, but I get the impulse that the wrong people think this, therefore we have to say the opposite. It can be the case that a consensus of American Western mainstream media who are for gay marriage or something can be right about something in international policy, can be right about the aggressor, who is the aggressor in a conflict, in a war. We don't automatically have to disagree with everything that those people over there, quote unquote, say. And I don't think there's not a single reason we should believe that way. It's kind of a paranoid and hyper suspicious way of approaching the world, and it can often lead us to embrace things that are ultimately worse, just because we're so terrified of our ideological opponents. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be cautious about mainstream narratives, like you said. Even Ukraine, even the Ukrainian media and state have an interest in painting the story a certain way. Russia has a big interest in painting the story a certain way, and Western powers, NATO, have an interest in painting the story a certain way. But it doesn't mean that one is necessarily closer to the truth just because they're, just because they're hated by our domestic ideological foes, if that makes sense. And it was a good piece, and he used the Russia thing as an example of this kind of thinking.
Well, there's just no substitute for discernment, because what makes this whole thing understandable is that the media is incredibly untrustworthy on all kinds of things, and has proven itself as such. And there's no question about that. So yesterday, the coverage on ABC News, there's about a 15-minute segment in the middle of this conversation about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, highlighting a handful of white supremacists in the Ukraine who were neo-Nazis. And I was like, that's a strange story to do right now. And is that story, what's behind that? Because that's the Putin narrative, is that the Ukrainian leadership is Nazi. Look, it may be true that there is a Nazi presence in the Ukraine. In fact, my guess is that there probably is. It may not be true that they have any sort of influence on life. It may be true that they have a bigger influence on life.
Guess what other country has a neo-Nazi presence?
You're right. It's one here that if Russia, for example, Russian media did a whole piece on how important it is to, our government, it would be a propaganda piece, because there are a lot of Nazis and they're pretty much irrelevant in American context. So, that's my point is not to argue one way or the other. My point is to say that's the level of discernment you have to have. And it's very easy to grab a predetermined narrative and embrace it and say, this is what's true about life in the world. And it's irresponsible that way. But there's just no way around discernment right now. You just have to do it. And you have to actually have the discipline to define your terms biblically, not partisanly. You have to have the discipline to stay calm when everyone else is losing their minds, and not panic when everyone else is panicking. Unfortunately, there's no limit to voices telling you the right way to think about everything, and there's just a need for that sort of discernment that we do together.